Just for a second, picture what tax season looks like in the ancient world. You aren't opening an app, checking a website, or mailing a check. Instead, a group of armed soldiers in bronze armor shows up at your door. They aren't looking for cash or credit cards. They want 3 barrels of grain, some dried fish, a few jars of olive oil, and 3 weeks of your time to dig a trench for the king in the hot sun. If you say no, you don't get a late fee. They might take your farm or even enslave your family. Today, paying taxes is just a boring chore, but it's actually pretty easy because of technology. Our money is just numbers on a screen or green paper. But for most of human history, that didn't exist. There were no banks or digital accounts. Still, huge empires like Rome, Egypt, and China managed millions of people. They built massive roads, cities, and monuments that are still around today. None of that was free. Every single stone and soldier's salary had to be paid for through taxes. Though, how did these old governments collect taxes across thousands of miles without a single dollar bill or spreadsheet? It's a story of humans being really clever, a bit ruthless, and very good at solving problems to build the world we live in now. To get how it worked, you have to realize how hard it was to move things back then. If you were a king 4,000 years ago, taxes weren't just about politics. They were a logistical nightmare. You had 3 big hurdles to jump, or your kingdom would fall apart. First, stuff rots. If a farmer far away pays with apples or meat, that tax becomes a pile of flies before it ever reaches the palace. You can't run an army on rotten food. Second, how do you know what things are worth? If one person brings onions, another brings a table, and another offers to sing, who paid the most? Without standard money, it's almost impossible to keep things fair. Third, can you trust your workers? How do you know the guy you sent to collect the grain isn't stealing half for himself and telling you the crops failed? If a ruler couldn't fix these issues, they couldn't pay soldiers. No soldiers meant no laws and no borders. The whole state would crash. To survive, they had to turn physical objects into a financial system. Their first big trick was simple: tax the food. In ancient Egypt, there were no coins or banks, yet they were one of the richest empires ever. Your secret? Grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were the money. Grain is great for this because everyone needs it. You can measure it out easily, and if you keep it dry and away from rats, it lasts for years. Everything in Egypt depended on the Nile. Every summer, it flooded and left behind great soil for farming. To tap into this wealth, the pharaohs set out officials called scribes, who were basically the world's first tax agents. Even before the harvest, scribes used nilometers to measure the flood. High water meant a huge harvest, so taxes went up. Low water meant a drought, so taxes were lower to keep people from starving or starting a rebellion. Once the crops were growing, scribes measured every field and did the math on how much grain each farmer owed, usually about 10% to 20% of what they grew. At harvest time, farmers brought their grain to giant government barns. These were like the central bank vaults of the time, guarded by soldiers and tracked by accountants. When a pharaoh needed to pay his army or the people building his tombs, he didn't use cash. He gave them grain, fish, and beer. Workers were paid in physical packages of supplies. The whole empire ran on a river of calories moving from farms to government silos. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and Babylonians went even further. Many historians think writing wasn't actually invented for poetry or religion. It was invented for taxes. The oldest writing we have, carved on clay 5,000 years ago, isn't stories. It's tax receipts and ledgers showing who brought in barley or goats and who still owed their tribute. To figure out value, the Babylonians used a smart mix. They used grain for small daily stuff, but for big taxes, they used silver as a standard unit, called a shekel, even though they didn't have coins yet. The famous Code of Hammurabi set official rates. 1 shekel of silver equaled a certain amount of grain. This way, a farmer could pay in grain, and a merchant could pay in metal, and it all worked out on the same balance sheet. To stop cheating, they used clay envelopes. A scribe would write a record on a tablet, wrap it in more wet clay, and stamp it. If someone tried to change the numbers inside, they had to break the outer shell, which would prove they were tampered with. While the Middle East used grain and clay, another empire on the other side of the world did things totally differently, without money or even a written alphabet. High in the Andes, the Inca Empire governed 12 million people. They built amazing places like Machu Picchu and thousands of miles of roads, but they didn't use money or barter at all. Instead of taking your stuff, the Inca taxed your time. This was called the Meta system. Every adult man owed the state a certain number of days of work each year. You didn't give the emperor gold, you showed up to work. For a few months, you might build roads, bridges, or farms, or serve in the army. Others made clothes or mined for silver. In return, the government took care of you. They built giant warehouses full of food and blankets along the roads. If your village had a bad year or an earthquake, the emperor opened the warehouse and gave you what you needed. It was a deal. You worked for the empire, and the empire made sure you don't starve. In exchange for this compulsory labor, the Inca state provided complete security and welfare. The government built massive storehouses called kulk along every major road in the empire. These warehouses were packed with freeze-dried potatoes, dried llama meat, woven blankets, and tools. If a mountain village suffered a crop failure or a sudden earthquake, the emperor simply opened the nearest kulka and distributed food and supplies to the affected people. The Mita was essentially a social contract. Citizens provided their physical labor to build the empire, and the empire used that labor to guarantee that no citizen ever starved. To keep track of all this labor and food without writing, the Incas used the quipu, one of the coolest accounting tools ever. A quipu was a bunch of colored strings with knots. Different colors meant different things. Yellow for gold, red for soldiers, and the knots showed the numbers. It was a portable, lightweight database that let the government know exactly what was happening hundreds of miles away. Imperial officials could look at these strings and know how many workers were available or how much food was left in a warehouse. It was a non-verbal system that powered an entire civilization. Not everything was just grain or work, though. As empires grew, they wanted taxes that were light and easy to carry. They looked for things everyone needed that wouldn't rot. One of the best ones? Salt. Today, salt is cheap, but back then it was like gold. Without fridges, salt was the only way to keep meat and fish from spoiling so people could survive the winter. Rulers realized that if you controlled the salt, you controlled the people. In ancient Rome, the government owned all the salt and taxed every bit of it. Salt was so reliable that Rome even paid soldiers with it. They got a salarium, which is where we get the word salary. When someone says a person is worth their salt, they are talking about a time when salt was literally money. In China, salt taxes were huge. To pay for wars, the emperor took over the salt and iron industries. At some points, salt taxes paid for more than half of everything the government did, including the Great Wall and the army. Elsewhere, empires taxed whatever was valuable locally. In the north, it was animal furs and butter. In Mexico, the Aztecs took cotton cloaks, feathers, and cacao beans. Cacao was so used as money that people actually tried to make fake beans by filling shells with dirt to trick the taxman. In other regions, empires taxed whatever regional commodities were most prized. In medieval Scandinavia, where grain was scarce, local kings and chieftains collected taxes in bundles of animal pelts, such as squirrel, fox, and marten furs, as well as tubs of preserved butter. In ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire demanded tribute from conquered cities in the form of woven cotton cloaks, tropical bird feathers, jaguar skins, and sacks of cacao beads. In fact, cacao beans were so widely accepted as a standardized tax and trade currency, the counterfeiters in ancient Mexico would painstakingly drain the chocolate insides out of a bean shell, fill it with dirt, and try to pass it off to tax collectors as real money. As empires got even bigger, though, managing thousands of bags of grain became too much. Kings needed a way to get money without all the paperwork. This led to a system called tax farming, and it was pretty scary. We see this in Rome. When they conquered new lands, they didn't have enough government workers to collect taxes from everyone, so they privatized it. They privatized the entire process. They held auctions where businessmen, called publicani, would bid for the right to collect taxes from a whole province. They'd pay a huge lump sum to the government up front. Rome got its money instantly with no work. Here's how the deal worked. A group of publicani would bid a massive lump sum of money, say 2 million silver coins, for the right to collect taxes from a province like Asia Minor for 5 years. They paid this money directly into the Roman treasury up front. Rome got its tax revenue instantly, with zero administrative hassle, zero transport costs, and zero financial risk. Then, the businessmen sent out their own private collectors to squeeze as much as they could from the locals. Whatever they collected over what they paid at the auction was their profit. This was great for the government, but terrible for everyone else. Since there was no limit on what they could take, collectors were brutal. They'd inflate what crops were worth and demand payment. If you couldn't pay, they'd give you a high-interest loan. If you couldn't pay that back, they took your land and your family. It was so bad it caused huge revolts, and eventually the first Roman emperor, Augustus, had to stop it and go back to a state-run system because it was destroying the empire. Tax farmers would show up at a farm with armed guards, assess the crops at absurdly inflated values, and demand payment. If a local farmer could not pay the exorbitant tax bill in silver or crops, the publicani offered him high-interest loans to cover the debt. When the farmer inevitably defaulted on the loan, the tax farmer seized his land, confiscated his livestock, and forced his children into debt slavery. The greed of the Roman tax farmers was so legendarily brutal that it destabilized entire regions, sparked massive peasant revolts, and fueled deep hatred against Roman rule. When the Roman Republic collapsed and Julius Caesar's nephew Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, one of his very first domestic reforms was to abolish the publicani tax farming system in favor of a professional, state-run civil service. Augustus realized that privatizing tax collection had made a few Roman businessmen unimaginably rich, but it had nearly destroyed the empire itself. No matter how smart the system was, people always tried to outsmart the tax collector. Tax evasion is as old as taxes themselves. Tax evasion is as old as human civilization itself. Throughout history, ordinary people found ingenious ways to hide their wealth from the government. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, when farmers heard the taxmen were coming, they'd bury their grain in hidden pits or hide their cows in the woods. In Greece and Rome, people buried jars of coins under their floors. Archaeologists find these today because the owners often died before they could dig them up. In ancient Greece and Rome, wealthy citizens buried heavy iron pots filled with silver and gold coins beneath the dirt floors of their homes or in remote countryside fields. Archaeologists today frequently discover these ancient coin hoards precisely because the owners buried them to escape war or heavy taxation and were killed before they could dig them back up. Things got too bad, people just left. In China and Egypt, entire villages would pack up and run into the mountains or deserts to get away from the king's guards. This caused a death spiral. Fewer people meant higher taxes for those who stayed, which made even more people run away until the whole empire collapsed. This created a dangerous death spiral for ancient empires. As desperate farmers fled the tax system, the remaining farmers were forced to pay even higher taxes to make up for the shortfall. This pushed even more people to abandon their land, causing crop production to plummet, government revenues to collapse, and empires to succumb to famine and foreign invasion. It's easy to think these old ways were just weird or mean. Paying in fish or building walls sounds like a different world. But if you look closely, the core of taxation hasn't changed at all. But if you strip away the modern technology, you realize that the fundamental reality of taxation has never actually changed. Money, whether it's paper or digital code, isn't wealth on its own. It's just a claim on someone's time and energy. When you pay taxes today, you are giving the government a piece of your work and your life. Ancient scribes measured that work in bags of barley. The Inca measured it in knots on a string. Today, a computer measures it in bits and bytes. The tools have changed, but the deal is the same. To build a big society, we have to pull everyone's energy together. Ancient humans didn't need the internet to build the world. They just used their hands, their crops, and a lot of clever math. The tools, technology, and media of exchange have evolved dramatically over the millennia, but the underlying social contract remains identical. Since the very dawn of human civilization, organized society has required a way to harvest the collective energy of its people to build something larger than a single individual could achieve alone. Ancient humans did not need paper money, complex stock markets, or high-speed internet to build the world we inherited today. They simply looked at the fields, the rivers, the mountains, and their own two hands, and found a way to make it all add up.